The sheer brutality of these murders earmarked them as something different.
We couldn't believe that the injuries could have been done by somebody of sane mind.
They weren't satisfied with killing them. They had to torture them.
And somewhere in this country at the moment there is a serial murder being reenacted.
In 1983, the neatly butchered remains of 3 young men were discovered blocking the drains of a North London house.
After having a corpse at his disposal, dressing it, undressing it, sitting it in front of the television, giving it a bath, after about 5 days it became unpleasant, and he would then put it under the floorboards.
He would let bodies decompose to a point, and he would then remove the flesh from bones. He dissected this into small pieces. Obviously there was a limit to how much he could actually flush away.
But the gruesome discoveries at Cranley Gardens were just the start. Over a 4-year period, the tenant, Dennis NILSEN, had killed 15 men.
This is a view at Cranley Gardens looking down the side alley away from the drain cover. This is a view actually looking down the drain where of course Dynarod first discovered human flesh.
I drove the CID car up to Cranley Gardens, and I was met there by Michael Catron, who was the Dynarod plumber. Mike had pulled some remains of what looked like just pieces of meat. And I was handed, or I selected 3 bones. Each of the bones was about 2 or 3 inches long and had a knuckle at each end, which struck me straight away that these could well have come from a hand, a human hand. So from a bit of a mystery, we suddenly realised we had a definite murder case on our hands.
The only suspect seemed to be the tenant of the top-floor flat. Yet it was Dennis NILSEN who had complained that the drains were blocked.
NILSEN came through the front door looking just like Mr. Ordinary, and as he came in, I said to him light-heartedly, "I've come about your drains." I had decided to adopt that approach with him because it had occurred to me that anyone who chops up a body and flushes it down the loo is going to be a little bit odd, to say the least. A smile came across his face and he said, "You know, since when have police been interested in blocked drains?" And I said, "Well, you take me up in your flat and I'll tell you." On entering the flat, I could smell that all too familiar aroma of decomposing flesh, and I said to NILSEN, your drains were blocked with human remains, and he said, "Oh my God, how awful." And I just pushed myself a little closer to him and I said, "Don't mess me about, where's the rest of the body?" And he just said straight away, "It's in 2 plastic bags in the other room."
We were pointed in the direction of a large wardrobe. And as you see there's the 2 large black plastic bags which have got body parts in. Also in next to these wardrobes there was a pile of tea chests which he'd carefully concealed by placing things like a hoover and a heater on the top of them as if they were being carefully stored. So obviously there were more bags with more body parts concealed in there.
I was driving the CID car and Steve McCusker was with NILSEN on the back seat. And I remember Steve suddenly out of the blue saying to NILSEN, "Are we talking about 1 body or 2? And NILSEN said neither. He said it's 16. Well, it later turned out to be 15 after we'd sort of gone into great detail.
NILSEN explained to the police that he had strangled all 15 victims. Then he was faced with the problem of how to get rid of the bodies.
He had a top-floor flat. He didn't drive a car, and he had no means of getting rid of, disposing of the remains of the bodies.
So Nielsen was forced to start the disposal process in his kitchen.
In fact, traces of human fat were found actually on the cooker from the kitchen. So obviously that had to be examined because it was apparent that he'd done things like boil heads, etc.
He said that a body cannot suffer, and it was I think he used a phrase. It's something that he wrote in prison. He said the disposal of the bodies was like the dirty platter after the feast.
And what he was doing for most of the time was cutting up the bodies into 4 or 5 sections, and then removing the flesh, flushing it down the loo, and putting the bones out for the dustman in black plastic bags.
He must have thought that the sewer system would actually deal with what it was that he was putting down. What he didn't understand were sewage and plumbing dynamics. If he had, he'd still be there.
In all, the police found the remains of 3 bodies at Cranley Gardens. But this was not the only flat Dennis Nielsen had lived in.
He'd had a previous address in Melrose Avenue, Willesden. He had a ground floor flat with a garden, where, in fact, as it turned out, he'd murdered another 12 men. He started off by putting the bodies under the floorboards and hoping that that would be the end of it. But of course, as he killed more and more people, he had less and less room under the floorboards.
He packed them into cardboard boxes, small suitcases, any receptacle really that he could find. And then he would light a large bonfire on waste ground at the back of the garden. And he would have a good old fire about 1 or 2 in the morning.
Nielsen now went out of his way to be helpful to the police. He even offered to return to the scene of his crime to locate the remains of his victims.
He admitted everything. He was very helpful. He was as helpful as he possibly could be, I think. He showed us the floorboards that he'd lifted to conceal the bodies underneath. And he showed us the garden where he'd had these bonfires late at night.
And it was all just so very matter of fact, as if, you know, he was describing a landscape gardening exercise, maybe. It was just very calm.
For him, control, and I don't just mean control of the people he killed at the time, but control of himself within the overall system, of the way he's perceived, of how he interacts with other people, is of great importance to him. It was then, and I think it remains so now.
We found 3 sites of bonfires in that back garden, and what we decided to do was to lift the first 12 inches of soil right across the garden and sieve it to try and find anything that would help us to identify the bodies.
We found very small bones, for instance, bones in the hands and the feet, the component parts of some 8 bodies, which obviously went along the road of confirming his multiple killing that he carried out at Melrose Avenue.
He said that he murdered for the first time in order to stop somebody leaving. It was an Irish boy, met in a pub in Cricklewood. We've tried to track him down, but we've never succeeded. We still don't know who that was. He went home with Nielsen. It was during the night, he said, that he realized this person is going in the morning and I'll be back where I started. And so, he said, I killed him in order to keep him.
It's easy to see how that can be interpreted as a lonely man looking for company. Nielsen wasn't lonely. He isn't lonely. The person who's most important in Nielsen's universe is Nielsen. What he was looking for was their physical presence. Passive, dead. So no, he's not killing for company.
He often referred to the fact that having murdered somebody late at night, he would wake up the next morning to find the dead body there and think to himself, oh, here we go again. I think he was tired of that part of it. I don't think he actually enjoyed the killing. I think the killings were just something that happened inexplicably.
Nielsen was a homosexual and met his victims in local gay pubs.
A lot of them worked in the catering trade. Some of them had left home to come to London to seek their fortunes. The only victim that just didn't fit that pattern at all was Kenneth Ockenden.
Ockenden, a Canadian student, met Nielsen in a London pub and was taken back to his flat in Melrose Avenue.
Kenneth Ockenden's murder was a spur-of-the-moment thing. I think it was later on during the evening, at a time when young Kenneth had decided he wanted to leave. I think Nielsen had taken quite a shine to him and was sorry that he was going to leave. That's probably what triggered that murder.
Dennis Nielsen had strangled Kenneth Ockenden and put his body under the floorboards. But at the time of his disappearance, there was nothing to link the two men. In fact, there was nothing to link Nielsen to any of his victims.
There was a certain amount of cunning involved. These were people in bars in central London. He knew that they had nowhere else to go, that they might not have anywhere to sleep, and they would not be missed.
13 of Nielsen's 15 victims were not reported missing. This meant the only clues to their identification came from their murderer.
Much of the information that Nielsen gave to us was very, very limited. One young man he described as having a tattoo around his neck, a dotted line with the words "cut here." That's all he could remember about him. There was another a young man that he could only describe as being Irish. Well, we had absolutely no chance at all with identifying them. Our efforts were therefore concentrated on the ones that we did have some specific information on.
With Nielsen's help, 5 of his victims were identified. Martin Duffy, a 17-year-old catering student, was part strangled, then drowned in the kitchen sink. Nielsen had met 27-year-old Billy Sutherland in Piccadilly Circus. Graham Allen had been invited back to Cranley Gardens, as had Stephen Sinclair. While Malcolm Barlow had literally turned up on his doorstep.
Nielsen took him indoors and cooked him an omelette. Barlow had told him he was on tablets from the hospital. But in spite of that, he insisted on having a beer with his omelette. And Nielsen had said to him, it's silly to drink when you're on those tablets. And Barlow said, well, I don't care. And that actually triggered the thought in Nielsen's mind, well, if he doesn't care, I don't either. And that was the end of him.
I opened the newspaper one morning to read of a man who had been arrested and was suspected of dismembering corpses so bizarre that I thought this might deserve some inquiry. I wrote him a letter, and he replied with a very unnerving opening line, which said, "Dear Mr. Masters, I pass the burden of my life onto your shoulders."
Over the next 10 years, Dennis Nielsen would fill 52 exercise books with his life story, giving the experts tantalizing clues to why he had killed so many. Dennis Nielsen grew up in the isolated Scottish fishing port of Fraserburgh.
When he was at school, when he was young, He would play with little boys that were, others wouldn't play with. He was a very caring sort of person.
Years later, while in prison, he wrote an account of the childhood influences he believed drove him to kill. They included the death of his grandfather.
Dennis would have been nearly 5 at that time. He'd seen his granda lying in this box. He was there 1 minute and he was gone the next. And everybody said, but he's gone to a better place. They never actually said he was dead. So he'd been thinking, why he took me everywhere. Why could he not take me to that better place with him?
From then on, NILSEN claimed he became obsessed with death and dead bodies.
It emerged at the Old Bailey hearing that NILSEN had bathed at least 1, possibly 2 of the bodies, talcum powdered it and left it lying on his bed at night. He saw his grandfather dead and noticed that he had a pallor and was trying to recreate seeing his grandfather.
Certainly a trauma of a losing a grandfather, a loved individual in a lifetime, can have a profound effect on an individual, but how many people who have lost a loved one have reverted to serial homicide? I don't see the connection. I don't see the link. And what I do know is that serial killers will oftentimes point to some event in their life that they use as a basis for to justify the acts that occur later on down the line.
All people were furniture to him, were objects. He didn't know how to relate to any of them. He had no love for life. He had no respect for life. He had no recognition of what life is, really. He said that the murderous impulse, when it occurs, cannot be resisted. It's something I had to do.
This is a man who is a psychopath. This is a man who killed people for pleasure.
They are incapable of establishing an interpersonal relationship, a good interpersonal relationship with another human being, living human being. And therefore they revert to necrophilia, they revert to possession, they revert to killing.
He never directly asked me whether I thought he was mad. But he did ask himself in front of me. He did say, maybe I am mad. Maybe that's the only explanation. But I don't feel mad, so I don't know what it's supposed to feel like. The logical part of him recognized that killing people was a wicked thing to do, that it was wrong, that it was inexcusable, and that he would have to be punished for it.
He said, it amazes me that I have no tears for myself. I have no tears for my victims, or those bereaved by my actions.
Dennis NILSEN was sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of 6 of his 15 victims. The small amount of remains found meant that even with his descriptions, identification of 8 proved impossible.
I usually solved everything in my family, and that's something I can't solve, because you can't put it back, life. I mean, if you steal, you can put that back, but when you take life, you can never make it right. Now I've got that hurt inside me, and I've got to live with that I can't make it right.